Hi, everyone, and welcome to the ACISTE Community Conversation for May 2019. And today is a very exciting topic that I'm really excited to get into. Normally, our broadcasts are an hour and a half. Today, it's going to be short, so I'm going to do a very short intro and turn it over to Katrina Michelle. So if those of you that are new to ACISTE, ACISTE stands for the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. And we have a twofold mission: to support people who've had spiritually transformative experiences, and also to support and educate the helping professions that help the experiencers. And today's topic will be introduced by Katrina, again, our executive director. My name is Elizabeth Sabet. I am the current board president. Katrina, welcome.
Okay.
Oh, you were muted there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk about Kundalini and spiritually transformative experiences, and with a thought about trauma today. And we're very honored to have two guests who have done extensive work in understanding Kundalini and writing about it and working with people directly. We have Dr. Bonnie Greenwell and Dr. Lawrence Edwards. So I'm really grateful that they could be with us today. And these community conversations we began as a way to really engage the community from ACISTE outside of our annual conference, which this year is in Atlanta in November. And the point of these conversations is really to open up dialogue about the experiences people are having, develop an understanding of how they're being treated in the field, both clinically and academically. So why don't we jump right in? And I'm going to ask Dr. Bonnie Greenwell, please introduce yourself. Feel free to take about 5 minutes. Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm a transpersonal psychologist and also a non-dual teacher in the lineage of Adyashanti. And nearly 40 years ago, I had a Kundalini awakening while I was in graduate school, and decided to do my doctoral research around the experience of Kundalini. For me, the experience was actually very positive, but I was running into a lot of people who were having difficulties. So I wanted to know what was the difference between why one person would have one kind of an experience, another a different experience. And that was the theme of my doctoral research, which later became a book called Energies of Transformation that was published 35 years ago. Since then, I have worked extensively with people who have had Kundalini arisings and also other types of awakening experiences. And I've written several other books. My most recent is called When Spirit Leaps, Navigating the Process of Spiritual Awakening. And so basically that's just been the theme of my life for many, many years. And I've studied a lot and learned a lot about the process, and learned probably the most from listening to hundreds and hundreds of stories of people that have talked to me from around the world. I was one of the founders of the Kundalini Research Network. Back in the day, we had conferences and programs. Right now, I don't believe it's functioning, but have met many wonderful people all over the world who work in this field. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwell. And Dr. Lawrence Edwards, again, thanks for being with us. Please take a few minutes and introduce yourself to our audience.
All right, well, my name's Dr. Lawrence Edwards, and it's been a pleasure seeing Bonnie again. Bonnie and I are old friends. And in fact, I met Bonnie through the Kundalini Research Network, and then I became president of that network and served as their president for 10 or 15 years. And it's in a dormant state right now, but we've done good work over the years. My background has included, Kundalini experiences that really started when I was very young. I wrote about it in a book called The Soul's Journey, Guidance from the Divine Within. Didn't learn about it as Kundalini as such until I got into university and became much more interested in Eastern traditions and started to see all these experiences and transcendent transpersonal experiences that I'd been having were related to what in the yoga tradition is known as Kundalini, which is the power of the divine, our own self, to know itself in its fullness. So as I began studying more deeply and spent years with Swami Muktananda and some of the great Tibetan Buddhist masters, found how this power and this energy is known across traditions and was very much alive in my experience, and was also overlapping with studies that I was doing in Western psychology from a Jungian perspective, as I was getting trained as a Jungian therapist at the time. And it has informed my work throughout most of my adult career. I did my doctoral dissertation on Kundalini as well, studied and practiced in a number of different traditions, and now serve through the nonprofit meditation foundation that I started called the Anamkara Meditation Foundation, as well as in private practice and doing consultations with people around the world through our great technology like Zoom here. But helping people to understand that, you know, from a non-dual perspective, this is their nature. The infinite is their most sublime nature, and that, in a sense, we're dissociated from our own self in the highest sense of what we are. And so we become identified with the mind and body as if that's the only reality we're capable of. And then people, for various reasons, sometimes traumatic, sometimes as a result of practices or initiations, begin to have experiences that are outside of what ordinary society or even psychology would think of as normal. But they're transpersonal, they're transcendent of individuality. And that can be the beginning of awakening to the truth of who and what a person is. But at the same time, they need help often to integrate those experiences and become grounded in it and see how it expands their life rather than contracting it. And that's been my life's work, is making that kind of knowledge and wisdom available. Tammy Simon, publisher of Sounds True, one time did an interview with me in a podcast that's free and available to people. It's on my website, thesoulsjourney.com. And afterwards she said, you know, you make a lot of sense about this Kundalini, and we should do a book and help people and make it available. So Awakening Kundalini, The Path to Radical Freedom, came out both as an audio program, a 7.5-hour audio program, and then also as a companion book that has more integrative information as well on how to really build that into one's everyday life. So doing that kind of work with consultations, writing other books and articles I've written, retreats that I run every year, that's just my way of trying to serve in any capacity that I can to support people on their spiritual journey.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. We're having a little technical difficulty today. For some reason, Zoom is giving us a whole host of different options than what we've had before. So hopefully y'all will bear with us. Katrina, would you like to ask the first question? I'm trying to unmute you. There you go.
All right, perfect.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, technology, it's such a wonderful gift and so frustrating at times. But here we are. So our first question, and this, you know, might be review for some people, but for those of us who could use a little bit of clarification, could you please explain how we can best understand the role and the process of Kundalini? How can we recognize it? And how can we best assist someone who we believe to be going through a Kundalini awakening? Dr. Greenwell, would you like to begin? We'll need to unmute you.
So the way that I've come to understand Kundalini is that it's actually the life force. It's we all have energy in our body. We're a pile of molecules. We're energetic structures. And the ideas in the Eastern traditions is that the energy that creates our bodies in the womb, the residual of that energy coils at the base of the spine and holds our energy field in stasis throughout our lives. And then when we die, it unravels and leaves the body. When Kundalini that's held at that base of the spine awakens and activates, it brings about a major transformative process. And so it can be very disruptive in somebody's lives. What you see is a wide range of responses to this energy arising, and it depends a great deal on your history, your personality style, your lifestyle, the kind of practices you've been doing, the kind of energy balance you already had or don't have. So many different factors can cause this energy to awaken, and some people don't have any great difficulty with it. It's a massive kind of a spiritual shift, and as it moves through the body, it brings them to deeper understandings of their true nature. Other people seem to get into a lot of chaos with it for a while. So it's a process of change, and everything that's in us that is inauthentic or an old habit, old ways of seeing things, old ways of being, patterns from our conditioning, is being released. It's being opened up and so that it can be seen more clearly. So you can go through many different changes, both psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, psychically. There's a whole range of phenomena that can arise. The same phenomena doesn't happen for everyone, though. It varies greatly depending on the history, again, and the practices, and possibly even previous lives and how one evolved in a previous life, what they were involved in spiritually. So you see a huge range of responses to this experience. But optimally, if you can make friends with it, if you can kind of connect with the energies and support yourself through this process, over time, eventually, it will move through the system and you may begin to open up to your true nature, to the sense of what you are, what pure consciousness is, before all that conditioning got attached to it. So the ideal would be to orient your life more spiritually, in sense of trusting that there's something greater than the egoic structure that wants to have a role in your life. Learning to take care of yourself in a way that seems compatible with what the energy is asking. So sometimes they have to make a lot of changes. Like some people become highly sensitive. They can't hold down a job where there's a lot of stress, or be in a big box store because they pick up other people's energies. Other people find that they're drawn much deeper into quietness, into meditation, into stillness. Some people have more trauma that's coming up. For example, if you have trauma in your history, and particularly if you've never done any therapy around it, those traumatic memories may arise as this energy starts releasing issues that are held in the energy field in your body. Might be releasing memories or stuck places where your body contracted during that trauma. And so you can be overwhelmed by old traumatic feelings. Sometimes if they're very early experiences, you don't even know what they're attuned to. You just feel the traumatic feeling. So in that case, you probably would benefit from working with a therapist that specializes in trauma and doing that repair work for the child within. But if you haven't had any serious trauma, everybody's had some loss or disappointments, or if you've done enough therapy that you kind of know how to hold those experiences, then the process can be much more comfortable. And it's a process. It takes years. It's not something that you just have one awakening of energy and suddenly everything's transformed. It took us a long time to develop the particular mindset and psychology we have now. And so it takes time for that to be, in a way, released or transformed so that we become much more centered in the core, which is a much more peaceful, centered place of presence. So it's a process, and I've seen it unfold in many different ways. So that's kind of an overview, anyway, of how I look at it.
Okay. Thank you, Bonnie. Just a quick follow-up to that before we move on to Dr. Edwards' response. I'm curious, in your experience, how might you help us to understand how to recognize a Kundalini process when we're confronted with it, maybe in our private practice?
It again. There we go. When I was doing my doctoral research, I interviewed a number of people that I felt were in a Kundalini process, and I also did a lot of research into the literature. And I've also spent some time in India later talking to some of the Kundalini people there, some of the masters. I came up with 7 categories of phenomena that I feel are characteristic of Kundalini. So if somebody's usually the most primary thing is that there's an initiating event of some sort where there's a shift in energy. And it can feel very dramatic. It feels different. Your body feels different than it did before. And so there might be some vibrating, shaking, going into yoga postures spontaneously, a feeling of a rush up the spine, or breaking out with the heart area, or some kind of a dramatic shift. But sometimes those things happen when Kundalini is not arising. For example, if you're under a lot of stress, or you've been in an automobile accident, for example, your body might shake the next day until your nervous system calms down. So if it's just a one-time event, just briefly, it may not have been a Kundalini arising, or maybe just a partial, and it's gone back down and settled down. So I also look over a period of time, have they had ongoing events of energy, vibration, heat arising, and various other energetic experiences. Also, there's often a shift in consciousness. Somebody might have an out-of-body experience, or they might have a vision, or they might have a sense of disassociation. Wait a minute, I'm not this body. All of a sudden I'm aware that I'm connected to everything. So there may be those kinds of phenomena that are shifts in consciousness. So a few people, not everybody, some will have psychic openings in the process where they suddenly become more psychically attuned. Some people have emotional surges of emotions. They don't even often know where they're coming from. Sometimes it feels like you're collectively processing an emotion that belongs to the collective in some way. So usually there's a whole series of events that go on for a period of time that suggest that probably the person is in this process. But I also look at what have they been doing? What could have initiated it? Because usually people who have a Kundalini arising either have long-term meditation practice and the energy started up when they were sitting in meditation, or they're doing shamanic practices or energy practices of some sort, or they may have been using psychedelics. So, or they may have gone through terrible grief, a great emotional overwhelm, and the energy started up during that time or right after that time. So I always I have a questionnaire I use when I do interviews with people, when I consult with them, to get all this background information. And then it's pretty easy to see what might have triggered the process and how their psyche, in a sense, was preparing itself for it by doing all these other things, whether they knew it or not at the time. Unfortunately, many people who sit for years in meditation centers or do breath work and energy work or psychedelics have no idea that this can happen. It's very rare for their teachers and the people they're working with to understand it or know anything about it. And so it can be extremely frightening just because they think maybe I've lost my mind or I've damaged my health in some terrible way. And unfortunately, they often don't get the support they need in the centers that are actually doing the practices that can open them up. So it helps greatly for them to have a calm person just listening to their story and putting it in a context that makes some sense. And if you can let go of your fear in this process, it settles it down enormously. The fear, in a way, amplifies everything that's happening and makes it much harder to deal with. So that's what I do. I look for the previous history. I look for the range of phenomena. Usually after a while, when I teach people, when I do webinars to train people in this process, I want everyone to hear everyone else's story, because the very best way for a therapist to learn is to listen to 20 different people talk about the process and what's happening for them. And then you begin to get a felt sense of what this looks like and the many different variations it can take. There's a lot that happens just intuitively after that.
Wonderful, very helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Greenwell. Dr. Edwards, love to hear your thoughts about how we can best understand the role and process of Kundalini and how we can recognize it, as well as how we can support people going through the process.
Sure. Well, a lot of my background and ideas on it are similar to Bonnie's, and so share a lot of her perspective. You know, part of, and even as she talks, you know, we can only say so much about the process as we're talking, but there's, just to add some things to what Bonnie was saying was, you know, in the yogic understanding of Kundalini, everything about us is the creation of Kundalini. So to understand the energy, the power of consciousness that manifests even our physical nature, that too is Kundalini. The mind and body are products of Kundalini. Classically, when we talk about Kundalini as awake, or awakening, we're talking about that aspect of consciousness that now can go beyond being identified with the mind and body. You know, it creates this vehicle, at first, the mind and body, that evolves consciousness over lifetimes until it hits that point of sort of ripening, where it's time to wake up again to our infinite nature, our boundless nature. And it's in the soul's journey across lifetimes when that awakening happens. And that awakening can be a spontaneous awakening, it can be a result of various practices. But if we had that ability to view that soul's journey and evolution across many, many lifetimes, we would see that that awakening is happening in the exact moment that consciousness was ready to move beyond the confines of an identity with mind and body. And then as we begin to have that kind of experience, that's where these transpersonal, transcendent experiences begin to arise. And one of the hallmarks of it with awakening Kundalini is that they're non-volitional, that the ego mind can't just produce these things. And that's what's so frightening to the ordinary mind, is because it thought it was the only one at home here and it was running the show. And now suddenly we have this transcendent consciousness that might be moving the body, putting it into postures. You know, the entire Hatha Yoga asana set grew out of the observations of yogis seeing the spontaneous movements that Kundalini produced. And it produces changes in posture. They became systematized and known as asanas. It produces spontaneous changes in breath. That became systematized and studied and is the basis of pranayama practices. And then also various meditative practices. Even mantra is, the root of mantra is Kundalini Shakti. The root of the Sanskrit language is Kundalini Shakti. So as we can enter these sort of transpersonal collective domains of knowing and consciousness, we can have the direct experience of that. So there's people who have never heard a mantra before and go into, through Kundalini, drawn into these states and hear mantras arising, just as the ancient sages did thousands of years ago, and then brought them back to serve as a vehicle for taking other people's consciousness back to that source. Because the real intent of Kundalini as the power of our own consciousness to know our infinite divine nature moment by moment, as clearly and surely as we know, oh, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I play this role, or I do this thing. We have the capacity to know our unity consciousness with everything with that same clarity, that same certainty. And that's the goal of Kundalini awakening and unfolding. But in order to be able to hold that experience and that energy, Kundalini has to move the body and the mind through various processes that will allow that consciousness to fully manifest through this vehicle, this mind, this body. And that's what happens. And, you know, I've worked with thousands and thousands of individuals. When I was running a clinic in Swami Muktananda's ashram in Ganeshpur in India, and I was training as a monk there for years, saw thousands of people coming through with all kinds of experiences. Most by far, the majority were positive. But some individuals have things lodged in their subtle body. So in the yogic system, we talk about the mind as a subtle body, and there are some scars, there are these patterns. It's the conditioned mind, but that conditioning goes back lifetimes. And the clearing out of that thing, that's what then causes the kriyas, the movements in consciousness, movements in mind, movements in body, changes in breath, that seem so ego alien to ordinary consciousness and can be so scary. But helping people to understand it, like Bonnie was saying, giving them a framework that says, no, this is actually a sublime, in fact, divine process. And here's how you ride through that and become attuned to your own power of the divine within. That's Kundalini. And where it wants to take you into this much more open, connected consciousness that dissolves the barriers between us and others and the rest of creation. That's where it's leading us. So those kinds of processes and the spontaneity of it and the non-volitional qualities of it are hallmarks of Kundalini. And so when I see that, that's a part of one of the signs that I look for, oh, that differentiates it from an anxiety attack, a panic disorder, other things that can be happening for people. Sometimes we have to do medical testing to rule out certain things, because I've had people come to me who were sure they were going through a long and difficult Kundalini process, but never had any kind of medical checkup. And I've seen cases where they had an endocrinological disorder, and once that was treated, their symptoms were gone. So it's very important that people understand that we can't jump to spiritualizing a set of experiences or symptoms without really looking at, oh, what's going on with the body? Is there something there that needs to be checked out? What's going on with the mind? What is a person's history? What's happened to them? What kind of trauma have they been through? You know, when you look at the research on adverse childhood experiences and trauma and the lifelong effects that those have, and all kinds of disorders, it's really important for a clinician to understand that and not jump to spiritualizing things or ruling that out. Because the other things, they can be happening simultaneously. Now, I've worked with people who have had both physical disorders, mental disorders, and Kundalini is awakening. And then that's a more complex picture, and they need very unique and additional supports in order to navigate that in this life for themselves. So it's not something that lends itself to being overly simplified. We can understand some of the general dynamics, but the depth of what can be going on for an individual is really quite amazing. Been my privilege to walk with people along their paths and support them in every way I can, to be able to discern, oh, what's physical, what's mental, what's the energy, how do we deal with that skillfully, what's going to be grounding, what's going to be integrative. So all of that comes to play.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards and Dr. Greenwell. This is a fascinating conversation. I wish we had 2 hours today instead of 1 hour. This topic is very much of interest to me as well. And thank you for segueing into the main topic for today about trauma. So I'd like to ask you, how do you understand the role of trauma when it comes to Kundalini? Does the trauma cause the Kundalini? Does the Kundalini cause the trauma? You both have kind of talked a little bit around this today. And then what are the best modalities for professionals to use when somebody comes to them believing that they're having Kundalini? Dr. Greenwell, would you like to start?
Well, I feel like in my experience with the people I've met over the years, that the majority of people who are in a Kundalini process are not experiencing trauma. Most of the ones that I speak to are experiencing surprise, curiosity, wondering what's going on, and a little bit of anxiety about whether they're okay or not, but they don't have terrible trauma over this process. Where I don't think Kundalini on its own creates trauma, but I do believe that if there is a traumatic experience in the history, that then a person is likely to feel trauma when the Kundalini arises, because Kundalini it feels invasive, even though it's your own higher power in a sense. It's your own consciousness that's the energy awakening you. It doesn't, you're not in charge of it. You didn't invite it. You don't know why it's there. And often an early childhood trauma is the same way. Somebody else has invaded you in some way and caused you to have to contract and protect yourself against the trauma. And that may have been repressed for 10, 20, 40, 50 years. And when the Kundalini arises, it not only loosens up those stuck places where that was held, but it in a way re-traumatizes you from the history. The memory comes up. You may not remember the event. Let's say you were only 2 or 3 and you were sexually abused. You may not have any conscious memory of that, but your body does. And so then it feels traumatic. And so what someone really has to do is work on the trauma. And they can work with a therapist who's trauma-oriented, who's experienced that way. The therapist doesn't really have to understand Kundalini to help a person get through the trauma. And I would say that would be, if a person's having great difficulty with Kundalini, that would be the first thing for a therapist to address, is what is the trauma in the history, and to use whatever approach they normally would to deal with that. And it varies greatly depending on the client and what kind of personality they have, what kind of needs they have. In some cases, somatics work of some sort is very helpful, energy work, release work. And in other cases, it's almost like a reparenting that has to happen. In some cases, you might, people use tapping and some of the other methods. I don't work specifically with trauma, and I particularly in recent years don't do psychotherapy anymore. So I know there's many, many different new modalities these days for working with trauma that I haven't worked with, so I can't speak directly to. One that I really do know about, though, is Richard Miller's I Rest Yoga. He's done remarkable things combining the deep experience of yoga, I've forgotten what it's called now. I'm blanking on it. But anyway, it's a deep relaxation process combined with some guided imagery. And he's done remarkable work with veterans from wars, with women who had been caught up in sexual abuse, sexual prostitution, things like that, and to heal them from the trauma that they've been involved in. So that's a very good method to look into. And he's a psychologist, a yogi, and also a non-dual teacher. So he's very got a wide breadth of supportive things he can do. And there's many other new things coming on. There's lots of help these days for people with that kind of history. But there's no reason for Kundalini itself, once you understand what it is, to cause trauma. It's actually, if you got to get into the right relationship of seeing it. One of the images of Kundalini in India is of a goddess, and Shakti is a goddess, and Shakti is our energy field, the creative force, the feminine force of creation. And if you can see it that way and talk to it and see it as wanting to bring you to the deepest potentiality for realization of truth, that's its intention. It's to clear away everything that's in the way of you knowing yourself to be directly connected to your source. You can have a tremendous impact on how it affects your body and how it moves through your system. You just have to surrender into it as you would a lover, and it makes it much easier to go through the process.
Wow, thank you so much. I love that explanation. Dr. Edwards, could you share with us your perspective on the issue of trauma and Kundalini?
Yeah, you know, our mind always tends to think in either or categories. And like, you know, is it Kundalini? Is it trauma? Is it mental illness? Is it Kundalini? Kundalini, we need to understand, is all inclusive. There's nothing left out of Kundalini. And it's not going to create trauma. A person's interpretation and experience and how they interpret their experience can be traumatic, and that can be resolved. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of times I'm contacted by people from around the world who have read so many negative things in the webosphere that what they're reading has traumatized them. They started out with a relatively mild experience, and now they're freaked out and convinced they're going to, you know, fall apart, or, you know, they read things, your ego has to die, and what does that mean? I'm going to die, and all kinds of misinformation comes their way. Whereas, yes, the Kundalini is there trying to give birth to our universal consciousness. And there may be some birth pains along the way, but what it's opening to is our oneness with the infinite and all that is. So when we look at trauma and how that gets lodged in the body, because that's an important component of understanding. And when I work with trauma, and I think the work of Bessel van der Kolk, also the work of Seaburn Fisher, using neurofeedback and biofeedback and working to help change what's going on with the brain. These are important considerations for how to work with the traumatic components that can come up as part of the work of your individual, your consciousness as Kundalini, trying to clear these things out. And sometimes it's bringing them to the surface so that you can be freed of those patterns, those stuck energies. And having people who are skillful and compassionate and selfless to be present with you is really important. And so, you know, I'm often advising people when they're looking around for, you know, guidance on Kundalini, to really examine who they're getting that guidance from, because there's a lot of well-meaning people out there who have very limited or even distorted information. And when they put that out, it actually leads to more pain and suffering for people trying to navigate these kinds of dynamics that aren't part of the ordinary Western paradigm. You know, years I spent studying and training and working in India, much more common knowledge, but often distorted amongst individuals there as well. So getting a reliable source from who gives the information without a hidden agenda. People are often vulnerable when they're going through these processes. And so they're also vulnerable to teachers who can be abusive or take advantage of their vulnerabilities. And I've dealt with many people coming to me trying to get out of the trauma that was inflicted upon them by a teacher who was supposed to be helping them. So I'm deeply concerned about what happens in this process, and that people get reliable, good, supportive information that helps smooth out the processes. As Bonnie was saying, and it's been clear in the yogic literature for thousands of years, fear and anger, well, they distort everything. They distort our everyday life. We know neurophysiologically, fear and anger distort our perceptions. They have a tremendous impact on our health, our well-being, or lack of it. And that does get amplified when this energy of transformation of Kundalini is moving, in part to awaken us to, oh, this is a pattern. This is a kind of energy you don't want to indulge in. You don't want to get caught in. You want to get out of with reliable, compassionate means. So I don't look at it as, trauma, either trauma or Kundalini, or which comes first. Awakening can happen through trauma. I saw that even out east here, when we had 9/11, and it was a horrific tragedy, and so many lives were affected. So many people died in the World Trade Center coming down. And I was being consulted by people who had these transpersonal experiences happen in the midst of those horrible traumatic experiences. And if you go back to an ancient text called the Kalarnava Tantra, that talks about that, everyday life experiences can be leaping off points into the infinite, can launch our consciousness beyond the mind and body. And then we're in this transcendent domain. And in that transcendent domain is this exquisite light of consciousness, blissful experiences, ecstatic experiences, unitive experiences. Well, imagine having that right after you saw what was happening, or were even in the what was going on with 9/11, and it created such dissonance in people, going, oh my gosh, how could this be? How could I have this ecstatic experience come up out of nowhere in the midst of all this horrible trauma? Well, that's one of the ways that trauma can push our consciousness beyond its ordinary confines into these possibilities. But then how to ground it and integrate it and see what's possible and deal with the trauma, that it's not escaping the pain, but it's going to give a new way of being able to integrate it and see it. So all of these are dynamics that can be going on in working with individuals who have a very real traumatic history. And often I see that when people have had traumatic childhoods, traumatic experiences as an adult, and they have some kind of Kundalini awakening experiences, trauma does change the color of their experience compared to people who haven't had severe trauma, and makes it something that, oh, they're going to need that extra support and extra understanding and care and attention to navigate those dynamics. But it's all towards the end of getting free, and free beyond anything, frankly, free beyond anything the mind can imagine. We can't imagine the state of freedom that opens up through Shakti, the conscious power of Kundalini. That's our nature. And that's where it's taking us.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Edwards. I miss these types of conversations about the role of Kundalini and consciousness, and I'm so glad that you're here today. This is going to be an important webinar for so many people, and I agree with you that we need to train people, professionals, retreat participant, retreat leaders, meditation leaders, spiritual teachers, about the potential of the work that they're doing with people and how it can bring them into these states. Katrina, I know that we're ready to do some Q&A from the attendees. Would you like to ask our first question?
Okay. All right. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to read the first question we have from Marianne. Marianne says, for about 15 years, I've been accompanying professionally people in Kundalini processes in which trauma structures played an important role. For me, the most difficult thing to endure is when the traumatic structures are strongly opposed to the inner healing processes initiated by Kundalini Shakti and seemingly cannot change. I believe that this has a lot to do with dissociative trauma processing. I've experienced, for example, that someone lying in a nursing home because this person, after a panic attack, can no longer walk. In their helplessness, the doctors give her a lot of medication. The inner healing process seems to have come to a complete standstill. My question is, how can we convey hope to these people? Is hope for healing really realistic? So, Bonnie or Lawrence, do either of you want to take that question? Okay. Elizabeth, can we unmute Dr. Edwards?
Well, I see that Bonnie wants to add as well, so I'll make a few comments, and I'm sure Bonnie's wisdom will shine through as well. Well, first of all, I think it's really important for the therapist has to be grounded in that practice themselves. They have to know. You're not going to convey hope as a theory, as an idea. You have to know that and have that direct experience yourself, and convey that from both your personal experience as well as the experience of having worked with many other individuals who have come through extraordinarily difficult processes to heal and go beyond whatever the trauma and the limitations that were being imposed. And so holding that vision for any therapist, that's part of what we do in everyday therapy, is hold the vision of what this individual is capable of. In the face of whatever is limiting them. And especially so when you're working with somebody who is being, experiencing that level of disabling or crippling trauma. And seeing also, it's often they need numerous forms of therapies, body therapies, mind therapies, physical therapies. When I write in the book, Awakening Kundalini, The Path to Radical Freedom, I talk about when people have had severe trauma or any level of trauma that's really disabling, they often need a team of support. And that team can have a number of different modalities involved to help them get through and transform what's going on with the body and what's going on with their mind and how to get free of that.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Dr. Greenwell, would you like to respond?
Yes. First of all, I do believe if somebody is heavily medicated, it does interfere with the process. It interferes with all processes. But sometimes if somebody's ill physically or in some other way, that needs to be healed, and before one works with the spiritual, you can't ignore if there's pain in the body, something has to be done to take care of that. And so, you can't bypass the physical world in order to have a spiritual experience. You have to take care of what's needed in the moment. However, even if somebody is dying, and I've experienced this directly, it is possible for them to be in touch with their essence, with the still point within, with the center. Think of it as we all come into the world as a pure, open consciousness, and everything else is layered on to that. And by going into silence, going into presence, finding that point inside of your own body, usually below the neck, it's not going to be in the mind. It's going to you're going to either find it in the heart area or in the navel area in the center. You can, by being in stillness yourself as a therapist or a hospice person or whatever role you're in, and simply accessing that profound still point within you and knowing that it exists in the other and inviting them to let go of the thought, let go of the identification, and simply find that still point in themselves. That is the way, not so much for healing as having a knowledge that you are not this disabled body and mind. That's not who you are. That's just an experience you're carrying at this moment in time. But what you really are is this stillness that is connected to everything, that has no boundary, that is not limited to the contracted physical form. And so to invite somebody simply to touch that, to help them wake that part of themselves up, is probably the most helpful thing if they're engaged in a issue where they're sick in bed and they're not capable of doing other things at the moment. It's not with the idea that, oh, we're going to heal the body, this is going to be a miraculous healing. It's not how it works. Sometimes you're very sick and you're dying, but you can touch into this presence that you are, that is eternal. And just touching that is so freeing, because there's a part of you that knows it's indestructible, and that it's simply carrying at the moment whatever the drama is that the life has imposed, but it's not who you are. And I think knowing that, for any therapist that works with these kinds of issues, needs to have touched that in themselves. They need to keep into their own spiritual process deeply enough that they totally trust that aspect of their humanity, because then they will know very clearly that it exists in every single other being, and they can convey that. So that, to me, is, I don't know if I'd call it hope so much as touching the freedom of what you truly are.
Beautifully stated. Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to remember that as therapists, we need to be responsible for doing our own work, not just intellectually researching and understanding, but really being with our own physical process ourselves. And like you mentioned, Bonnie, being able to convey that sense of stillness and presence. So thank you for that answer. Okay, and I'm just going to ask you if you want to comment quickly. We have 2 questions, and I'm just going to give you the general idea, and if you want to comment really briefly so we can wrap up at the hour, that would be great. So the first question is asking about addressing spontaneous Kundalini arising in children, how it occurs, and support for the process. And then we have someone asking about nutritional supports for the Kundalini process. So if either of you would like to comment just really briefly on that before we wrap up.
Words. I haven't worked directly with children who are in a Kundalini process. I think that some people may come in the world with the energy activated, and they don't know that their body's any different than anyone else's. And so it's not a particular issue. And I think that for the most part, a person's body needs to be mature before the whole process can do what it needs to do. But I do want to say that I often encourage people to get an Ayurvedic consultation. I'm sure that Lawrence knows more about that than I, but that the medicine of India, they understand energy balancing and harmonizing. So it's useful to get an understanding of what, for their body type and their energy imbalances, might be the best way to eat. And I also want to just mention that I have been interviewed quite a bit on different programs on YouTube. And if somebody wants to get a more overall picture of how I work and what I have to say about Kundalini, Buddha at the Gas Pump, I've done a couple of interviews, and there's several others on YouTube where if you just put in my name, and you'll get a more comprehensive overview of my perspective of working with this process. So, thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Lawrence?
Yeah, well, working with kids, we've had a lot of kids in the ashram I was a part of with Swami Muktananda, and the Kundalini process was just part of their normal developmental process, but so was the normal developmental processes of being a child and learning to be a person in this world. And so it's important that one doesn't obscure or negate the other, that it's an integrative process. And that's something that parents or teachers can work with, that yes, it's everything from you're developing an ego. It's not who you are, but it's a great tool. It's a great servant. And so we want our ego consciousness to be completely functional, and it gets us out of bed in the morning, and we put our shoes and socks on, and we do all these things. And that's all part of your developmental process, as well as often for kids. these other domains of consciousness the doors were already open. So it was already normal to them. It was more like, oh, that's interesting. You validate it, you listen to it, you hear what's going on for them. And in that context, they're not being invalidated, because so much of ordinary, scientific materialist culture invalidates experiences of the transpersonal and transcendent domains. But also helping them to say, yeah, and as this divine being, you're going to do this as well today. We're going to carry out this function and get this kind of thing done. And so they're getting a very integrative approach to life that's just natural to their being, frankly. And I think if you read, a good resource looking into this is to read the works of the late Joseph Chilton Pearce, an old friend and colleague of mine who wrote about developmental psychology, and especially related directly to Kundalini. So some of his books, I think, are very helpful. He and I did a lecture tour in India back in the 80s, and it was great.
Great. Thank you so much, Lawrence. So I think we're going to wrap up for today and let you both get on with your days. It's been so good of you both to donate your time and your wisdom to us today. I know it really means a lot to the ACISTE community. So thanks for taking the time to be with us. And thank you all for tuning in and being with us today. And just a reminder, we do have a support directory for anyone that might be looking for individual assistance. You can look at our website, ACISTE.org, assist.org, and you can look up our directory of mental health professionals, spiritual directors, spiritual life coaches who may be able to support you in your process. And please keep an eye out for our upcoming conference, November 14 to 16. We're in Atlanta this year, and we'll be opening up registration shortly. So if you're interested in coming and earning continuing education credits and developing this community and just being with us as we all learn together, please keep that in mind. And Elizabeth, is there anything else you want to say?
Thank you. No, I think you've mentioned it all. I just want to thank everybody who attended today. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Greenwell, for donating your time today to help educate our community and to create this conversation in our community, which, as you know, is so important for so many people, as more and more people are having awakening experiences. And just remember, we do have, if you're an experiencer and would like safe, confidential conversation about your experiences, we do have an experiencer forum that is private and it's not social media. And if you would like to get on that forum, you can email me at info@aciste.org and I'll be sure to send you an invitation. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We will be ending our broadcast today and wishing you all a very well and blessed day. Bye, everyone.